Let me just start with a little bit of mood music to put us in the mood for the talk. I assume you are all singing along to that. So in this talk, I'm going to look at the Gospel of St. Matthew and look at the account of the Magi and the report of the star in the east that prompted them to journey to Jerusalem. I'm going to have a look at possible astronomical candidates for the Star of Bethlehem. How well do the possibilities fit the account according to St. Matthew? And we'll have a look at timeline. How well do known events that occurred at the time fit with the Nativity? And then at the end of the talk, I'm going to use some planetarium software, some Starry Night software, wind the clock back 2,000 years and actually have a look at what happened in the sky during the time of the Nativity. And then I'll summarise at the end. So firstly, let's get the account sorted out. The principal elements of the Gospel according to St. Matthew, there are 5 elements that we would like to try and explain. So the Magi journeyed to Jerusalem prompted by a star in the east. In red there is the first item, the first element that we're trying to explain. Bear in mind it doesn't actually say, the account according to St. Matthew doesn't talk about them following a star. It talks about their journey being prompted by a star in the east. When they got to Jerusalem, they asked King Herod, "What's this we hear about the birth of the King of the Jews?" And Herod was unaware of what they were talking about. The Magi then journeyed on to Bethlehem, where the star reappeared in the sky and finally stopped over Bethlehem. So in red there are the 5 elements that we would like to try and account. Why would it be called a star in the east? Why would that lead the Magi to think about the birth of the King of the Jews? Under what circumstances could Herod perhaps not be aware of what they were talking about? How could such a star reappear, and how could such a star stop in the sky? If we can find an astronomical candidate that ticks all of those 5 boxes, then we might have found a candidate for the Star of Bethlehem. That's the idea. So before we get into that, let's just go back to the Christmas Carol and listen to the lyrics of just the first part of the first verse. Let's not get into the full thing. We 3 kings of Orient are, and that verse ends with following yonder star. Well, if we start unpicking this particular Christmas carol, we realise that we shouldn't really be talking about 3 kings of Orient are, because nowhere in the account according to St. Matthew is the number 3 actually stated for the number of Magi, the number of wise men. It's often assumed that there were 3 Magi, simply because the account does report the 3 gifts that were brought. The gold, frankincense and myrrh. So if there were 3 gifts, it's often assumed that there were 3 Magi. But there might have been 27 Magi, 3 of whom brought gifts and the other 24 ended up looking at each other thinking, were we supposed to bring gifts? So we don't actually know that there were 3, so we shouldn't really put 3 in the Christmas carol. We should remove that word. And again, the account talks about Magi or wise men. It doesn't talk about kings. That's an invention, so we should remove the word kings from the Christmas carol as well. We don't know where they came from. They came from somewhere east. It might have been the Near East, it might have been India, it might have been Mongolia, it might have been the Far East, so it could have been the Orient, but we don't know exactly where they came from. So maybe we shouldn't talk about any particular geographic area either. And as I've already said, the account doesn't actually talk about them following a star. It talks about them journeying, being prompted by a star in the east. So we shouldn't have following yonder star either. So you can see this particular Christmas carol is rapidly falling apart and looking rather threadbare. And being a scientist, I believe in precision and accuracy, and therefore we shouldn't use words like 3 kings of Orient if there's no evidence that there were 3, or they were kings, or that they came from the Orient. So we really ought to rewrite this particular Christmas carol. And it ought to be something more akin to something like, we indeterminate number of men of unspecified geographic origin are. And instead of following yonder star, it should be just saw a star. So you can immediately see why physicists don't write Christmas carols. It doesn't meter quite as well as the original. But bear in mind, whenever we talk about the 3 wise men, we really ought to talk about the n wise men, where n is a number greater than 1 and less than infinity, presumably. So that's just something to bear in mind. The Christmas carol is not a good guide to the Star of Bethlehem. So when we talk about a star, what is it we're talking about? Remember that a star doesn't mean a star in the sense that we understand it today. Especially an astronomical society will have a clear idea of the difference between stars and other objects in the night sky. But when we're thinking about the Star of Bethlehem, star can mean almost anything. So remember, wandering star is the old name for what we would now call a planet, because planets would wander through the pattern of fixed stars. The fixed stars are fixed in the sense that although they move during the night because of the Earth's rotation, they all stay fixed relative to each other, whereas a planet will wander through the fixed stars. And some stars might be hairy or have a tail to them. So a hairy star is what we would now call a comet. And of course, shooting star is a colloquial name that is still used today for meteors or meteor showers. So star could mean, in principle, a star, or it could mean a planet or a comet or a meteor shower or something else. So we must remember that star really just means something seen in the night sky, other than, I guess, the moon. So let's just be broad about our definition. Do we get any clues by looking at any depictions of the adoration of the Magi? Of course, these were painted substantially later than the Nativity itself, but do we get any clues about the Star of Bethlehem? Here's a depiction from Botticelli, 1475. It's widely believed that this is Botticelli himself on the right-hand side, so this is really a selfie that just happens to have the adoration of the Magi in the background. We see Jesus and Mary and presumably Joseph with the Star of Bethlehem up above, perhaps shining down onto the baby Jesus. Joseph himself looking very bored there in the background, not taking part in any of the celebration apparently. Well, perhaps that's appropriate because he didn't play any part in the conception either, so maybe that's all well and good. 1423, a little bit earlier, again we see what appears to be a star in the background, but we get no clues as to what it might be. One of the few painters that actually painted the Star of Bethlehem that appears not to be a star, Giotto, 1305, where it appears the Star of Bethlehem is depicted in the sky here and looks very much like a comet. I assume that this must be a comet in this depiction, which is one of the reasons that when Halley's comet returned, the probe that was sent to actually image the nucleus of Halley was named Giotto. Other depictions a little bit later this time, Rubens, I'm not sure exactly what date this was, but this is one of the depictions of the adoration of the Magi in which, as far as I can tell, there is no Star of Bethlehem in the background, unless it's hiding there behind that two-headed camel that seems to be poking its head, one of its heads, into the scene there. And again, if we go around the same time, it would appear that we have a stellar-like object. That's not so much a tail sticking out to the bottom right of the star, it's just a little beam of light which is shining down onto the baby Jesus by the looks of it. And similarly, Van Lint, 1630, again we see what appears to be a stellar object in the background shining down. It's no surprise that these pieces of art don't actually tell us anything new about the Star of Bethlehem, because they are not historical documents. They are just artistic renderings of what people expect to see, such as, for instance, 3 Magi. It's always 3. No one ever seems to do less or more. It's always that 3 because of the 3 gifts that were brought. And we must also think about the astrological significance of what's seen in the sky. Every planet, every bright star, every zodiacal constellation had some astrological significance, which is key to what we're going to say in a little while. So, for instance, Venus was thought of as a symbol of beauty, a symbol of fertility, and a symbol of birth. And Jupiter was a symbol of royalty, especially kingship, because Jupiter was considered to be the king of planets. Regulus, as I'm sure some of you know, is the brightest star in Leo, Alpha Leonis, and as you can tell from its name, it's considered to be the king of stars. Leo itself is associated with the Lion of Judea, because that is the symbol of the tribe and the land of Judea. And so the lion in the sky is often associated with the lion associated with the Jews. So why did astrologers continually look at the sky and make these associations between objects they can see in the sky and certain properties, such as beauty or birth or royalty? Well, that's because it was assumed that what was seen in the sky was always a sign of what is about to happen. In other words, if you want to know whether good news or bad news is on the horizon, whether you're about to have a wonderful crop or a famine or a flood or something else is going to happen, you will get a warning, you will get a sign in the sky. As long as you can read the sky according to the astrological significance that's applied to planets and constellations and stars, then you can read the signs that God is telling you about what is going to happen to mankind. So if you wish, think of it as the sky was God's Facebook page. This is where information was posted telling you what's going to happen in future weeks, months, or possibly years ahead. And that is why it was so important, because if you wanted to know the future, you continually scanned the sky. So let's have a think at what star candidates we could possibly shoehorn into the account according to St. Matthew. We're going to have a look at a few possibilities, and then we're going to consider those 5 categories. Could the star be considered to be a star in the east? Would it have been significant? Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of said star? Could the star reappear, and could the star stop in the sky? So we're going to look at a few candidates in order. Firstly, let's think of shooting stars, meteors or meteor showers. Is it possible that that could have been described as a star in the east? Well, as I'm sure you know, meteors can flash effectively anywhere across the sky, so there's no reason why you would ever say the star appeared in the east. Would it have been significant? Well, meteors occur every night and meteor showers occur throughout the year, so there's no real reason why you would attach any particular significance to a meteor shower. Is it possible Herod wasn't aware? Well, yes, in the sense that it's not significant, so why would Herod be aware of what the Magi were talking about, if that's what they were talking about? Could the star reappear in the sky? Well, a meteor shower can appear and then die away, and then another meteor shower can start some weeks or months later, so yes, the star could reappear in the sky. Could the star stop in the sky? Well, it's not clear how you would ever talk about a meteor shower stopping in the sky, so that doesn't seem to fit. So a couple of the boxes are checked, but the others don't seem to fit. What about the appearance of a comet? Could a comet appear as a star in the east? Well, indeed it can. Would it be significant? Well, if it was a bright enough comet, then certainly it could have been considered significant. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of said comet? Well, if the comet was bright enough to be significant to the Magi, surely it would have been bright enough to be significant according to Herod. Herod himself didn't have very good eyesight, but we're assuming that he has a number of astrologers to tell him about what's going on in the sky. Could a comet reappear in the sky? Well, that's certainly a possibility. Comets go around the sun, and for a while a comet might be visible on one side of the sun and then maybe disappear for a while as it goes behind the sun and then reappear on the other side of the sun. So yes, a comet can reappear in the sky. Could a comet stop in the sky? Well, that's a little bit of a question mark, because although generally speaking comets whiz around the solar system, and the last one we saw, for instance, Comet Neowise, tracked across the sky, moved quite a bit from night to night, it is possible, depending on the orbit of the comet, for the comet to temporarily make part of its orbit moving towards the Earth, and so it might appear to stop in the sky if it's a particular orbit at a particular part of its orbit. So that is a possibility, if somewhat unlikely. What about a nova? What about a new star? Technically not a new star, but a newly visible star, a star that was either insignificant or perhaps invisible to the naked eye, which then brightened considerably and became visible for a while. Could such a star have appeared in the east? Indeed it could. Could it have been a significant appearance? If it was bright enough, it would certainly have been considered significant. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of this sign? Well, again, if it's bright enough to be visible to the Magi, wouldn't it have been bright enough that Herod would be aware of it? So again, somewhat uncertain. Could the star have reappeared in the sky? Well, this star would have brightened if it was a nova and then presumably faded away, but nova don't tend to brighten on very short timescales. They might brighten and then fade, and they could brighten again some years or decades, maybe even hundreds of years later, but it is unlikely that it would have re-brightened over a very short period, so that doesn't seem very likely either. And why would you talk about a nova stopping in the sky? A nova is a star like the fixed stars, so it would have appeared at a particular point relative to the fixed stars, and it would not have moved. So why would you talk about such a star stopping in the sky? So that doesn't seem to fit either. What about a supernova? Well, it sort of falls into the same category. Yes, it could have appeared in the east, it could have been significant. If it was significant, why wasn't Herod aware of it? Again, we have a little bit of uncertainty there. But again, could the star reappear in the sky? Well, generally a supernova is the result of a star blowing itself to pieces. Once a star has done that, it's unlikely to do it again. Once it's dead, effectively, and therefore you don't really think about a supernova suddenly brightening a second time. So the star reappearing in the sky doesn't seem quite right. Could the star have stopped in the sky? Same as with a nova, the supernova position would have been fixed relative to the other fixed stars, and therefore there's no reason to talk about it stopping in the sky. So that doesn't seem to fit either. But the final candidate, which as you can probably tell by the fact that I've left it till the last, is the one that seems to fit most of the facts. Could it have been a conjunction? And here I'm using this symbol here on this slide and on future slides as the astrological symbol for a conjunction. Could a conjunction of planets been seen in the east? Well, planets are going around the sun, of course, at different rates, depending on how far away they are from the sun, and a particular conjunction of planets could indeed be seen in the east. Would it have been significant? Well, we come back to the astrological significance of particular planets and particular constellations. So yes, depending on the combination of which planet in which constellation, that could have been seen as significant. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of it? Well, he might have been aware of the particular conjunction of planets, but wouldn't necessarily have applied the same astrological significance. And so when the Magi ask, "What's this we hear about the birth of the King of the Jews?" Herod might have been aware of the conjunction, but not necessarily of the interpretation of that conjunction. Could the star reappear in the sky? Well, because planets are always on the move, it's possible to have a conjunction of planets, and then sometime later those same planets could come into conjunction a second time. So yes, a conjunction, if that's the star, could reappear in the sky. And could a star stop in the sky? As we'll see shortly, when we're thinking about planets moving around the sun, although the planets are always in motion, it is possible for a planet to appear, to stop in the sky. And therefore, conjunctions effectively tick all of the boxes here. And therefore, if we can find a conjunction that fits time-wise and in terms of interpretation, then perhaps we found a candidate for the Star of Bethlehem. So firstly, something you probably already know, but let's just make sure. When we're talking about planetary orbits, inner planets will move faster than the outer planets, and so two planets that happen to be in the same part of the sky at the moment, let's say as seen from somewhere close to the Sun, those two planets appear to be in the same part of the sky. But as time goes by, the inner planet moves faster, and so the planets are now separated in the sky, but at certain times, like now, they will appear to be in the same part of the sky again and will cross each other. And again, different parts of the sky, except now they are back in the same direction in the sky. Now, generally speaking, the orbits of the planets are in slightly different planes, and therefore when two planets get close together in the sky, they usually pass each other north-south. One goes over the top of the other, if you like, in terms of our viewpoint. So they might get close, but they don't usually get close enough to be fused together as a single object. Generally speaking, they might get perhaps within a fraction of a degree of each other and then pass each other. More often, planets will pass maybe more than the diameter of the full moon, more than half a degree apart. That is not uncommon. But one second aspect of planetary motion that we need to consider is what happens when we are observing from an inner planet. Let's imagine the green planet is Earth, so that's our point of observation, and imagine that the red planet here is one of the outer planets, Mars or Jupiter or Saturn. Then, because, as I've just said, the inner planets are moving faster, although the planets will seem to move from west to east, from night to night as the year goes on, planets will generally move from west to east. It is possible for a while that the Earth will overtake the planet on the inside lane. Remember, the Earth will be going faster because it's closer to the Sun. And so for a while, the Earth will be going faster than the outer planets. And just like on a motorway, if you're in a car that's overtaking another car, then for a while that car that you're overtaking will seem to be moving backwards, even though you're both moving forwards. The same is true of planetary motion. So if we think about what happens to the appearance of the planet relative to the fixed stars, as the Earth overtakes it on the inside, we find that the planet goes from west to east, but then after a little while, as the Earth overtakes it, the planet stops in the sky, moves backwards, stops again, and then moves forward. And that's purely a result, nothing to do with the outer planet itself, purely the result of the Earth overtaking it on the inside lane. Let's just see that again. Generally moving from west to east, but although that normal positive direction stops and then the planet moves backwards and then stops a second time and then continues moving forward. That will happen whenever the Earth overtakes the outer planet. So that's something to bear in mind in what's to come. Let's have a think about the timeline. Here I've got the years of about a decade or so BC. We're going from 1 AD backwards 1 year, remember, to 1 BC. There's no 0 in the gap in between. Bear in mind that if you try and reproduce what I'm about to show you, some planetarium software actually has a year 0 between 1 AD and 1 BC. Which is incorrect. There was no year 0. So if you're going to try and reproduce this, just check whether or not your planetarium software of choice, whatever it happens to be, make sure that if you go to 1 AD and then go backwards, it doesn't click over to the year 0, which doesn't exist. So here we've got a decade or so BC. Let's think about when Christ was born. Jesus Christ, as far as I know, was probably born between 4 and 8 BC, based on the fact that King Herod died in 4 BC. And then from the various accounts, we know that Christ was born during the reign of Herod. So 6 BC is often quoted as the probable birth of Christ, give or take a year. However, when you look at the records, the various reports of when King Herod died, there's no definitive date, because it's always King Herod died in this period after the lunar eclipse, which came after, I don't know, after the flood, which came after the famine. All events are related to other events rather than a particular calendar necessarily. And a number of biblical scholars, I can't comment on the veracity of this, but a number of them believe that the wrong lunar eclipse was used to date the death of King Herod. And quite a few people believe that King Herod didn't die in 4 BC, he died in 1 BC, which means Christ might have been born in a couple of years prior to 1 BC. So there's a little bit of uncertainty as to whether we should be looking around 2 BC or whether we should be looking around 6 BC. But let's have a look at what astronomical candidates would have been around at about the right time. Comets. There was certainly a comet around in about 12 BC. This was Halley's Comet. And it would have been quite bright, probably, given that every appearance of Halley's Comet has been quite spectacular since then. But isn't that a little bit early to be putting something on your Facebook page saying something interesting is about to happen? If Christ wasn't born for 6 or 8 or 10 years later, surely that's a little bit early to be a sign. There was another comet around in 5 BC. That was Comet Holmes. Perhaps some of you photographed Comet Holmes a few years back. When was it? 2007, when it passed relatively close to the Earth, and its coma expanded very rapidly over a period of about a day or so. So although Comet Holmes would have been around, it's unlikely it would have been particularly bright at the time. And so we don't think that was a candidate. Bear in mind that comets are like cats, they have tails and they're unpredictable. We can work out where in an orbit a comet would have been. It's very difficult to work out exactly how bright it would have appeared at the time, because that depends on how much the sun is evaporating the ices in the comet and producing the tail. So we can't be definitive as to how bright, but it's not thought likely that the comet of 5 BC would have been bright enough. The comet of 4 BC, that's Churyumov-Gerasimenko. To most people that's known as simply the Rosetta comet, the comet that Rosetta went to and dropped the little Philae lander, etc. But again, although we know it was in approximately the right part of the sky, it isn't likely that it would have been bright enough based on what it's doing at the moment. It doesn't seem likely that 2,000 years ago it was particularly bright. So that doesn't seem to fit the bill. The timing works, but it doesn't seem to be the right sort of sign, if you like. And also, we're a little bit dubious that it actually ticks all of the boxes in terms of the 5 elements of the account that we're trying to match. What about a nova? Well, according to the Chinese, there was a nova in 5 BC. And according to the Koreans, there was a nova in 4 BC. Bright nova don't seem to come along very often. So is it the case that there was none for 100 years and then suddenly 2 come along at once? Doesn't seem very likely. So it's considered more likely, excuse me, that these are actually reporting the same nova. So maybe the dates have got slightly mixed up, or maybe they're a few months out of kilter, and a nova in perhaps late 5 BC or early 4 BC would have been seen by the Chinese and by the Koreans. But for the reasons we stated earlier, a nova, although it might have been in the sky at the right time, doesn't seem likely because it doesn't match the criteria in the account according to St. Matthew regarding stopping in the sky, etc. And it doesn't move relative to the fixed stars. Excuse me. What about conjunctions? And here I'm using the symbols just for brevity. The symbol for conjunction, and then I've got Jupiter and Saturn. They're down here on the bottom left if you've forgotten the symbols we're using here. So there were conjunctions of Jupiter with Saturn at about the right time, if you believe that Christ was born somewhere around 5 or 6 BC. But I think much more interesting is the set of conjunctions that occurred around 3 to 2 BC. These are conjunctions between Jupiter and Venus, rather than the conjunctions between Jupiter and Saturn, for instance, similar to the ones we're going to see, the conjunction that we're going to see towards the end of this month. On the 21st of December, there's going to be a conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn, but I'm interested in this talk about conjunctions between Jupiter and Venus. And I'll show you why in some videos that I've made. Rather than jump into the Starry Night software, on a Zoom presentation, I think it's a little more reliable to show you videos of the Starry Night software running in time-lapse. So you can't perhaps read everything on the screen here, so let me make sure you know what we're looking at. We're looking at a particular chunk of the zodiac here, the constellation of Leo and Cancer. Excuse me. And at the moment it is set to the 1st of August 3 BC at about tea time. And I'm looking at a chunk of sky and I have labelled only a minimum number of things. I've labelled the constellations, so we've got Leo here and Cancer here, Gemini is off to the right, etc. And I've labelled the planet Jupiter. I haven't labelled all the stars, I haven't labelled all the planets, because otherwise when you start doing a time lapse and things start moving, the labels get very confusing. So I've only labelled Jupiter, and I'll point out Venus where and when necessary. So as I'm sure you are aware, the brightest star in Leo there is Regulus. And also in this particular simulation, in this particular time lapse that I'm going to show you over a period of some months, I am not going to continually show you night and day because that gets flickery and very annoying, and I'm not going to show you the horizon jumping around all over the place either. I am just going to look at this part of sky and see what happens to the planets, because that's where all the interesting things are occurring. Okay? So to start with, we are going to run a few days, and Jupiter is going to move from west to east as it usually does, and this is the planet Venus coming up behind it. Venus is closer to the Sun, so is moving faster, so Jupiter is going to move a little bit and Venus is going to move quite rapidly. And so we're going to see what happens over the next few days. So we see that Venus and Jupiter get very close in the sky, in the constellation of Leo. The distance between, the angular distance between Venus and Jupiter is going to be similar to the angular distance between Jupiter and Saturn that we're going to see later this month. In other words, they're going to be a few arc minutes apart. It's going to be close enough to be interesting whenever you get two planets that are separated by less than the size of the full moon, which is about half a degree or 30 arc minutes. Whenever you get two planets closer than that, it's a very interesting close conjunction. And that's what we're going to see with Saturn and Jupiter. Roughly speaking, the same angular separation. But what's important here is the interpretation of this particular close encounter, this particular conjunction between Venus and Jupiter in the constellation of Leo. Because if we think of the astrological significance that would have been applied by astrologers, Venus is symbolic of birth, Jupiter is symbolic of royalty, especially king, because it's the king of planets, and this conjunction occurs in Leo, and Leo, remember, is linked to the Lion of Judea. So Venus and Jupiter in conjunction in Leo could be interpreted as Venus, birth, Jupiter, king, Leo, Jews. Birth, king, Jews. This is a sign that something interesting is going to happen, who knows when, and it relates to the birth of the king of the Jews. That is the first sign that the Magi might have seen. I add that I don't know where the Magi were, so the actual precise position of the planets would change ever so slightly if we move to a different position on Earth, but a few thousand miles over the distance that we're talking about from Earth to Venus or Earth to Jupiter, that would be tiny. So it doesn't really matter what the actual position is. But the timing of this particular star, this particular conjunction that signs the birth of the King of the Jews, this particular star would have been seen in the east shortly before sunrise. The sun is actually further over there to the east of Venus and Jupiter. So this would have been a morning star. Venus would have been a morning star, very bright, about magnitude -4. Jupiter not quite so bright, but still spectacular conjunction seen in the morning skies as a morning star. So this is the star in the east. What happens over the next few months is quite interesting. Venus, remember, is moving faster than Jupiter, so Venus is going to go flying off to the east, and Jupiter is going to slowly move in the same direction. So let's see what happens. Jupiter, you see, now moves close to the star Regulus. There it is, passing the star Regulus, a relatively close conjunction of Jupiter with Regulus. And over the next few days, over the next few weeks, Jupiter stops its motion in the sky. We're still moving forward in time, but you notice that Jupiter has now stopped in the sky and is now starting to move backwards. Remember the retrograde motion, because the Earth is overtaking Jupiter on the inside. So Jupiter's now going backwards, and notice that it passes Regulus, the king of stars, a second time. The king of planets has passed the king of stars not once but twice over the period of the last few months. And then Jupiter stops in the sky again and then continues its forward motion, and the king of planets passes the king of stars a third time. So over a period of a few months, we're now in early part of 2 BC rather than the late part of 3 BC. During those few months, the king of planets has passed the king of stars not once, not twice, but 3 times, a triple conjunction of kings. Something is happening of one king dancing around another. Is it indicative of one king passing the crown from one king to another king? Perhaps. The Magi might have been very interested in that particular interpretation. But what must have sealed the deal was what happened just a little while later, the following month, which was truly remarkable. Jupiter will continue, now it's had its retrograde motion, it will continue moving to the east. And here is Venus having come round again. Remember, Venus is closer to the Sun, so it goes round the Sun much faster than Jupiter. And now Venus is catching Jupiter up again. So let's see what happens over the next few days. Venus comes into conjunction with Jupiter again in the constellation of Leo. Venus, Jupiter, Leo, birth, king, Jews. This particular conjunction would have been much more spectacular than the previous one, and much more spectacular than the conjunction we're going to see later this month. Remember, in both those cases, the earlier conjunction of Venus and Jupiter and the conjunction we're going to see later in the month, the two objects would still be seen as two objects. They're far enough apart that anybody with reasonably good vision will be able to separate them as two separate objects. But this conjunction is really, really close. How close is this conjunction? You can't see from this software unless we zoom in, because at the moment we simply see Venus and Jupiter as one object. But how close are they? Let's center Jupiter in the field of view and zoom in about 1,000-fold, which of course is much higher than could be done without a telescope, but let's just see how close that conjunction is in June of 2 BC. Let's zoom in. How close do you want them to be? This field of view here at the moment is 1 arc-minute from top to bottom. So the separation of the two planets is much less than 1 arc-minute. So I don't believe any human alive, either now or then, would possibly have been able to separate these two objects. Venus, it's shown here as the surface of Venus rather than the blindingly bright white clouds of Venus. But remember that Venus would be a magnitude of about -4, Jupiter not quite as bright as that. These two objects would have come closer and closer night after night, and at this particular point they would have merged over a period of 1 or 2 days or 3 days. They would have merged into a single object whereby people could not separate them as two separate objects. So two bright objects would have come together to make an even brighter single object for this particular conjunction, with a separation of just a fraction of an arc-minute. A few arc-seconds would have separated them. I don't know how often this conjunction would take place this close. I believe a conjunction this close would only happen a small number of times in 1,000 years. So I think it's fair to say that none of the Magi, none of the astrologers of the time, would ever have seen a conjunction this close before. So again, they get the second message, birth, king, Jews, because it's Jupiter and Venus in the constellation of Leo. So they got the heads up last year. They then saw the the king of planets and king of stars doing a little dance, and then they see this absolutely spectacular conjunction of the two planets. So let me just remind you of the timeline we're talking about. In August, there was a close, not particularly spectacular, but close conjunction of Jupiter and Venus. They would have been a few arc minutes apart. They would have just about still be seen as two separate objects. Venus, Jupiter, Leo, birth of the King of the Jews. Later, the King of Planets and the King of Stars would have passed each other, not once, not twice, but 3 times over the course of a few months. A triple conjunction of one king with another king. Something interesting is going to happen. And then in June of 2 BC, that spectacular conjunction could have been the starting pistol that told the Magi, why are you still here? Go to the land of Judea and give homage to the new King of the Jews. How long would it have taken the Magi to get there? Well, we have no idea. We don't know how far they've come. We don't know if they came from next door or a substantial fraction of the size of the Earth away, whether they came from Mongolia or whether they came from the Far East. We don't know if they walked, or we don't know if they came by camels, despite what it indicates on the Christmas cards. So it could have taken many months for them to get there, and one possibility is they didn't actually get to Jerusalem or Bethlehem until the end of 2 BC. Why is that relevant? Because at the end of 2 BC, Jupiter stops in the sky, and that gives us the 5th element of the account according to St. Matthew, because if Jupiter stops in the sky, that could have been a sign that yes, we've arrived and the star has stopped in the sky. Whether you regard it as over Bethlehem or not, that's open to interpretation. On which particular day in December does Jupiter stop in the sky in 2 BC? Well, the day it happens to stop in the sky is the 25th of December. Yes, I know that there's no particular significance in that. The 25th of December was simply taking over a pagan festival, so there's no particular relevance to that. It's just a little bit of a coincidence that the day Jupiter decides to stop in the sky does happen to be the 25th of December. And that may or may not have been the time that the Magi actually arrive, if you believe this particular timeline that seems to fit all of the elements of the account according to St. Matthew. So maybe it was these conjunctions of Venus and Jupiter in the constellation of Leo that inspired the account in the Gospel of St. Matthew, which may have been written some 100 or more years after the Nativity. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was a different astronomical event or a combination of events. Maybe it was a conjunction and something else that occurred within a few months that gave rise to the account of the Star of Bethlehem. Determining the astronomical facts is not difficult. We can take some astronomical software and we can run the clock back hundreds or thousands of years and we still get a fairly accurate indication of what the sky was doing. We don't know exactly what the separation of Jupiter and Venus was, but trying it on different pieces of software, they all seem to indicate the conjunction was really close and less than would be resolved by the human eye. The timing might be off by a few minutes or an hour or so, but generally speaking, we can say with some certitude that those events did take place. Second guessing the significance that the Magi or any other astrologers would have attributed to those events, that's a different matter. That is pure speculation. Astronomical facts are facts. The astrological significance is pure speculation. All I'm saying is that if you take that interpretation, it matches the elements of the account, or is consistent, if you wish, with the elements in the account according to St. Matthew. But regardless, of course, the underlying message is still the same. May you have a very peaceful and a very Merry Christmas. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much.